WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM's Master of Business Administration is designed to accommodate the career needs of professionals across a variety of work organizations. More information at business.udmercy.edu.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, flying solo with you today as Tia Graham enjoys a well-deserved week of vacation. A little bit later in the show, we're going to talk about the reopening of Dutch Girl Donuts. It's set to return this summer. We'll talk to the new owner about why so many people are talking about it and what he hopes to do with the reopening. But first, on the program, Michigan is known for its cars. And we know cars can sometimes be very loud. In fact, that's sometimes the point for some people, right? Showing off a little bit of that vroom vroom and the muscle that you have in the engine. Sometimes letting people know, hey man, this ride right here, it's pretty cool. But what kind of harm is done when cars are making their noise even louder intentionally? And not for any reason that's related to the power of the vehicle. Is it a mere distraction or is it something more serious? And how much of our loud cars are part of the culture here in Detroit? To discuss this now, we have State Representative Natalie Price, who recently introduced a bill that would penalize those who make their cars intentionally louder. Representative Price, thanks for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much for inviting me to join you today. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation with you.
Well, I'm happy to be part of it also because I didn't even realize loud cars were as much of an issue as they might be that we need to even think about raising the fines for them. So before we even get into what this new proposed law would do, in terms of the issues with loud cars, what are you hearing from your constituents? What led you to even want to sponsor or start this bill?
I represent many communities right along Woodward, and when I'm out talking to my constituents, this is in the top three things that I hear. When I ask the question, what issues are impacting you, your family, and your neighbors, the excessive noise on Woodward is a top issue, and it's causing real harm to folks in our communities. So I come from Berkeley City Council. I live in Berkeley. I also represent Birmingham, Bloomfield Township, Royal Oak, Beverly Hills, and my constituents in those areas note this as a real, not only inconvenience, but a real harm to them and their families.
All right, so let's unpack harm, right? Because I hear that word, and I think a lot of us would think of physical harms or harms that have some issue with our health, maybe a monetary harm. An annoyance wouldn't be so much something that rise to harm. So when you say harm, can you tell us specifics that you're talking about? How are folks hurt by this?
There are real health consequences to excessive and sudden noises. We know that folks, especially some of our most vulnerable community members, we have folks who need sleep to heal, folks on hospice, folks recovering. We have veterans with PTSD who have reached out to my office. Some of these modifications intentionally sound like gunshots going down the street. And these kinds of abrupt and loud and excessive noises are really harming people's health. You talk about, harm to property. We know that excessively noisy roads are a huge factor in property values. This issue has gotten significantly worse just in the last 5 years, and people are concerned about the value of their homes right along Woodward as well. So those are just some of the ways in which excessive noise is harming our people. We also know it's harming businesses, it's harming our communities, and I think that often when people make these modifications, they don't consider how they are impacting the communities that they're driving through.
Yeah, so I want to get into that a little bit later, but let's make sure we're talking about the same issue also from the top, and that's specifically the modifications you're referring to, because you said some of them sound like gunshots. I think when a lot of people hear about noise, I think of the vroom vroom of the guy in the motorcycle who's looking to the left of me at the starting line like he wants to race or something. That's not necessarily what you're talking about. Let's say specific, or you tell me, what are the specific modifications you're trying to target with this legislation, and how would it do it?
Yeah, so those vroom vrooms, again, when a vehicle has been modified in order to amplify those sounds, that's part of what we're talking about. But not only that. When I first sat down with the Birmingham police chief to get a better understanding of this issue, he pulled up a website where you could go and order a part to have $88, have it delivered to your home the next day, and you can install it in your garage. The accessibility of these modifications that people put on their vehicles in order to make these sounds like gunshots, like some are very high pitched, some of them are the more traditional vroom vroom, whatever they are, if they are excessively louder than how the manufacturers have developed and released those vehicles, that's what we're talking about targeting with this legislation. And I should say, too, right now in our vehicle code, it is already illegal to modify your vehicle and have it create excessive noise. Unfortunately, according to my local law enforcement and the experts, the attorneys that I've consulted on this, there's some contradictory language there in the current vehicle code that has made this very difficult to enforce. There's also the current penalty of $100 fine for these modifications hasn't been a deterrent to the folks who are participating in this behavior. So our proposed bill cleans up that contradictory language, separates out the explicit decibel levels, which are intended for the manufacturers to measure and comply with in their controlled environments, from the enforcement that's needed out on our public streets. And then the fine.
Yeah.
We are proposing changing it from a $100 fine to $500 for the first offense, $1,000 for subsequent offenses. But also an important part of this is the ability for the fines to be waived. If you put that money toward getting your vehicle back in compliance with the code, you can show that and have the fines waived. So we're using this to encourage people in terms of personal responsibility to invest that money into getting within code and stop continuing to harm our communities.
We're speaking with State Rep Natalie Price of the 5th District, which includes Berkeley, and she's introduced a bill to penalize drivers, or I should say modify and increase penalties for drivers who illegally alter their vehicles to make them louder. One of the things that you mentioned, Representative Price, was Woodward, which came up a lot. I mean, this is something that's an issue on main roads, right? This isn't something that people are bringing up in terms of side roads and Berkeley and Royal Oak and et cetera, all these other places, or are they?
So right now, local municipalities can do local ordinances and enforce those on their side roads. So I do think that the excessively noisy vehicles have been an issue as well on some side roads. Yeah. But the municipalities that struggle with that have local ordinances that address it, and they're able to be enforced.
Yeah, and
Woodward is a state highway,
right.
And so there's no ability to enforce those out on Woodward. We really need a statewide solution to this problem.
Well, that's why I wanted to jump into that, because we do have mechanisms for local cities that are worried about places where you would expect some silence. But one of the things I think about is by being on Woodward, there's going to be some benefits, the sight line, the classic highway. You have more traffic that goes up and down. But if you're also a resident who lives on Woodward or a business who lives on Woodward, there may be some negatives that come with that. There may be some more noise. There may be people who want to express themselves in a way. What would you say to someone who says, look, this is the benefit of the bargain. You're impeding too much on what we're doing on the road. You're the one who chose to be on Woodward. You could be someplace else.
That is something I have heard. And part of what I say to that is, again, this has really changed just in the last 5 years. Folks, when they decided to move closer to Woodward, were not expecting the levels of noise and the modifications that we're hearing now. And again, when we're talking about the kind of harm that's being done with it, property values going down as a result, it takes away people's freedom and ability to move away. And there are some who I've talked to residents who have had to relocate as a result of this issue. we're trying to find a very reasonable solution to hold people accountable, encourage responsibility, and stop the harm rather than having the response to everybody who is being harmed to just move out of the area. I don't think that's
well. No, Representative Price, I certainly wouldn't disagree with you there. I think where the tension is here, and what we would talk about, is that harm, right? The demonstration of the harm, and this is what we're always concerned about, right? You don't want to impede on somebody else's lifestyle, but the question is, we all have to put up with some amount of annoyances. I got to look at Metro producer Sam Corey's loud shirts all the time when he comes into the office. It's offending to my eyes, but I understand, you know what? It's okay. That's him expressing himself. So I think what we're just trying to tease out here is, where is that level, where is that line, and how we can best do it, which is one of the reasons why I appreciate you coming on the show and helping us talk about that. Before we get out of here, I did want to ask you one question, though. You mentioned this was one of the top 3 issues your residents or constituents bring up. What are the other 2?
Yeah, when I'm out in these communities talking to people about the things that they care about, often it's local roads, local pothole, local things right here in front of my house. I am in a great position that I came from local government, that I served on Berkeley City Council before becoming a state representative. So I know that, technically the state is not responsible for fixing that pothole on your local road. However, the state is responsible for revenue sharing, for getting those municipalities the financial resources that they need to be able to fix the roads and the sewers and keep people safe. So I think that hearing from my constituents that they need more resources for their municipalities is good. We just proposed, yesterday we voted a great proposed budget out of the House that addresses just that proposes setting up a new fund for local revenue sharing to bolster what's been done in the past. We also are proposing more money for roads and pipes and just making sure that our hometowns are getting the support that they need. Right. Another thing that my constituents care very passionately about is efforts to reduce gun violence. And as a former teacher, as a mom with a 9-year-old and an 11-year-old, that's a big part of what I came here to do, to make sure our kids are safe and able to focus in their schools on learning. So we are proposing more resources to enforce and to educate people about the legislation that we've done in the last year and a half related to preventing gun violence. Right. We brought red flag laws, which enable law enforcement to temporarily remove weapons from somebody who poses an immediate risk to themselves or others. We're finding great success, hearing lots of great feedback from our local law enforcement that they appreciate those tools. It's preventing suicides. It's preventing potential gun violence within our communities. But we have to get the word out. Yeah. Also, our safe storage. It's now illegal if you own a gun to have it be accessible to your kids and other people who shouldn't have access to it. That's right.
And we are making some changes there, and you've been helping with that. Representative Price, I got to move on, but I appreciate you coming on here and helping us learn a little bit more about your constituents and this new law that you're proposing regarding loud cars.
Thank you.
It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, and coming up, we'll talk about ways Southeast Michigan is becoming more integrated. It's the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, and thank you so much for being here with us. As we just talked about, one of the things Detroit loves, of course, vehicles is really important to us. We love Coney dogs. We love our Lions. There's a lot of things that we love together. But despite this, the city has almost never been fully integrated throughout most of the 20th century. It's because of segregation, which was reinforced by policies we've discussed, such as redlining, restrictive covenants, things that systematically limited where Black and non-white Americans could live, and ultimately led to a lot of our suburban areas becoming predominantly white, while cities like Detroit would remain or become predominantly Black. But these trends appear to be changing. Detroit suburbs and cities are becoming more integrated according to new research. To learn a little bit more about that, we're joined by an associate professor of sociology at Eastern Michigan who recently wrote an article for Bridge Detroit about how Greater Detroit is becoming less segregated. I'm talking about Professor Grigoris Argyros. Professor Argyros, welcome to the Metro.
Yes. Good morning, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. I'm even happier to have a second crack at saying that last name, so thank you for bearing with me on that. But I want to start with your piece in Bridge where you were talking about how Detroit is one of the most segregated cities in America. Before we get into how things are changing, can you just explain how we got there?
How we got there in terms of segregation?
Well, let me put it this way. Can you detail for folks who might not understand or realize how segregated the city is? Can you explain what Detroit segregation looks like according to you in terms of the numbers that you've looked at?
Yes. I will just start by looking. Well, the current article that I wrote is part of a larger project that I'm looking at currently. And to give you an idea of the degree of separation, and by the way, these I'm using statistical indicators that are very common in similar research, and the most common one is what we call the index of dissimilarity, which basically looks at the degree to which the two groups are evenly spread across an area. So, according to the latest data that I analyzed based on the 2020 census in Detroit City, in the city of Detroit, I found that approximately 60%, 6 out of 10 whites or Blacks would literally have to move a neighborhood location in order for both groups to be evenly spread across the city, in simple terms. And according to research, the rule of thumb is that any numbers over 60% is considered high segregation. Anything under is moderate or even lower. So that's where we are right now.
And how does that look compared to other places around the nation, by the way, just so we can have that kind of comparison?
Well, yes. Before I answer your question, 60% is considered, according to research, and the scale is considered in the high range, but still that number has decreased across the years. Going back at least to 2000, there's been, or even before then, it used to be in the 80s. So yes, segregation has decreased. In terms of where Detroit City stands, it stands high up there in terms of segregation levels, especially between whites and Blacks, just focusing on these two groups, because there are other indicators that incorporate more than two groups. So what I mean by high up there, I would say a conservative estimate, top 10, if not top 5. Detroit is high up there, Chicago, New York City, and especially on average, cities in the Northeast and the Midwest, which tend to have higher segregation levels than places in the South and the West.
Yeah. One of the things, if I could just jump in here, because that's really good background for us to think about some of these changes, is one of the things that really struck out in the report is how some of the reason for, or some of the changes that you noticed between 2010 and 2020 in the census, as you mentioned, was that there are more white people living in the city of Detroit than there were previously. How much does that account for the integration or the rise in integration that we see happening?
Right. Yes. I did find, yes, as you said, from 2010 to 2022, according to my numbers, I found it was approximately 41% increase of white non-Hispanic, to use census terms. And and by the way, there I found a decrease of whites in Metro Detroit, in the Tri-County area outside Detroit City. Now, in terms of how that fares with respect to segregation and integration, I mean, obviously that would obviously make a difference in terms of the racial ethnic diversity that whites in Detroit City live with. But at the same time, there's also an increase of non-white groups. So we have two forces at play here, population-wise. So we have an increase of whites in Detroit City, but at the same time, we have an increase of non-whites, especially such as Latinos, Asians, folks who checked off two or more races, identifying two or more races, according to the census category. And I should also say that we see a decrease of blacks in Detroit City. So there's not just there's multiple factors at play here in terms of how these how different racial ethnic groups in Detroit City how they maneuver space in terms of where they live.
Yeah. Yeah, you've gone through a lot of the numbers, a lot of the interesting findings that we've had here. Let's back out a little bit just in terms of why you even became interested in this subject and why you think it's important. So what led you to even decide to look through to these numbers, and why would you say it's important for us to take a look at them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And that's a question actually that kind of evolves as I get older. And the reason I say that is because, well, number one, I mean, I love numbers. Numbers say a story in terms of, in this case, in terms of demography, population. But specifically, I'm interested in racial ethnic groups because growing up in New York City, in the Bronx especially, which is a predominantly diverse county, I was always curious as to why different racial ethnic groups live in different neighborhoods. And I should also add that I have an immigrant background in terms of my parents. I've also lived in another country. So juxtaposing my experience here in the United States with that elsewhere, it was always fascinating to me in terms of how these neighborhoods were demarcated by race and ethnicity, which is something that I'm still researching on.
Yeah. It's something that I think we've all kind of seen a little bit. And of course, there's this tension between wanting to be in a place where you feel comfortable, you feel safe, you feel seen, versus benefits of us being able to cross the aisle and speak with other folks who aren't necessarily part of the same culture. Do you see this tension rising anywhere in the numbers? And how much do you think, if at all, integration is important based on your research as a sociologist?
Well, to directly answer your question, I would just have to say the data that I have cannot speak to that,
right,
in terms of personal feelings and so forth. However, there are other great scholars in sociology who look at such issues. I look at specifically more aggregate patterns from a more quantitative perspective. But one thing that I do see is we also see it in Detroit City, and also out in the suburbs in the Tri-County area, the sense that whites there's an increasing likelihood of whites residing in neighborhoods with other non-whites. So there's increasing diversity. So in other words, aggregate, speaking in the aggregate, the odds of, let's say, an average white person today of interacting or living in a neighborhood with a non-white is much higher today than it was back in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah. Well, Professor Argyros, I only got a limited amount of time. That's the reason I'm jumping in here. Got about a minute left, but I just want to give you an opportunity because we've been able to go through the numbers, but I'm sure there's more that you want to know. What's the next steps? Is the next thing that you're going to be looking into that you think is important to find out as you continue your research?
Well, specifically with this project, I'm looking into some of the factors that lead to these unequal distributions, locational, residential distributions. And I'll be examining, statistically speaking, in a multivariate framework, looking at variables that are very common in research, such focusing on socioeconomic status, family household status, as well as factors pertaining to housing discrimination and other race-related factors that have been that research has found to affect how racial ethnic groups sort themselves in place.
Yeah.
And especially even more interesting in Detroit, since 2024. This year marks the 10th year since the city of Detroit exited bankruptcy. I believe it's in December. It's somewhere in December is the official date. So it's pretty interesting, in my opinion, to see how Detroit has changed and how do we define that change, especially as it pertains to racial ethnic diversity.
All right. Well, we are going to be looking forward to that. And Associate Professor of Sociology at Eastern Michigan University, Grigoris Argyros.
No worries.
Thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
It is the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and coming up, we'll hear from the latest conversation Stephen Henderson had on Created Equal with a new author, Tracy McMillan, about her most recent book. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and I'm Nick Austin here hanging out with you. And, we can hang out not only each weekday at 11 a.m. as well as 10 p.m. You can also listen to us online via podcasts, but not the only show here. A lot of great shows, including Stephen Henderson's Created Equal, which airs every morning at 9 a.m. And recently on the show, he spoke with author Tracy McMillan, who has a new book out called The White Bonus. We'll learn more from that conversation right now as they began by discussing why Detroit's suburban schools have historically been segregated.
Digging into this history, it was just really shocking to me how resistant white parents seem to have been to this idea of just sharing, right? Because it wasn't like you weren't going to have a school for your kid. You just didn't want to share the school resources with Black families, right? And that was also something I think white folks get raised sort of hearing, or certainly in my generation, that there was hatred, people didn't want to share schools, but was actually often about resources, right? And white folks now will sort of lean into sort of the kumbaya thing about let's all get along. But for Black families, it was very clear that the reason they wanted integration was not some great yearning desire for unity or to be close to white people, right? But to have equitable resources for their kids.
Right.
And so when you see white families going out with higher incomes, right, which then are generating more taxes in those areas, right, all of that's the way that sort of both wage and housing discrimination works in favors of white families, right? Then you're generating more tax base for those districts and sort of hollowing out the other ones.
Yeah. And that was kind of where I was headed next, is why that translates to advantage. Talk about when white families leave a community to go to another, how resources follow them through the white privilege that you're talking about.
Right. So there's sort of two things that come to mind there. One, employment discrimination, right, often translates to higher incomes for white families. So you have a greater income tax base, as well as just sort of more time to spend with your kids, or more resources to spend on your kids, right, than you can if you're making less money. And then certainly housing discrimination, right, where white homes are seen as more valuable than homes owned by Black folks, right? Generate to more property taxes and therefore more income for schools, right? And so all of that stuff sort of combines to sort of give a sort of buoyancy to white families that Black families often don't get, right? Doesn't mean it's impossible for Black families to have resources and things. It's a much stronger uphill battle.
Yeah. So much of this for you is personal. I mean, this is your life story in some ways, and it's your parents who make this decision to move to Holly rather than to stay in Ferndale or Oak Park. What do you make of that? I mean, there is this question, I think, that we always have about our parents and their intentions, what they knew, what they didn't know, and why they did the things that they did. In this case, do you believe that your parents were racists in a sense, and not active hatred-filled racists, but complicit in the system of discrimination and inequality that forms structural racism? In other words, actors in the trouble that we have had with the notion of equality.
Yeah. No more than anybody else probably, but yeah, right? I mean, I think that's the thing that I've really had to grapple with, right?
Yeah.
Is, because I look at this, I'm like, this seems really clearly to have been motivated by a discomfort with the idea of your kids attending a school that was going to be mixed, right? And a lot of that comes from this assumption that whiteness should carry a certain kind of privilege and advantage to it. Now, I've asked my father about this. He tells me now that he doesn't remember. He didn't really think about the schools when we were moving. He doesn't know my mom has passed. So, he'll tell me that, he remembers sitting in the backyard of this little house that we lived in Oak Park and hearing 5 different languages, not one of them English. And he never really talked to the neighbors, but, he wasn't comfortable there and didn't like hearing everybody, right? Didn't like living close into people like that. And so, to me, that seems fearful of others that you're not like. And then that's the sort of heritage that gets passed down to me, right? And, I came out of this project really struck by how little honesty there was from my parents and grandparents about the world that I was sort of being born into and brought up in, right? I sort of feel like, was Sesame Street like some cruel joke? Like we didn't want to share ever, and sort of thinking that through. And I will say, I say that about my parents. I love my dad. I love my family. And I also don't think that they're unusual, right? Because I think that often, if you talk to somebody in your family, say, well, you feel like you're being racist, people take that as this like personal thing. And,
Sure.
I've gotten very comfortable in doing this work with being like, well, sometimes I'm being racist. And that doesn't mean I believe in white supremacy as a value, but like I'm also raised in a country where that's very normal. And, sometimes I'm a jerk about things, and sometimes I include being a jerk about race, and I have to work on it.
Yeah.
And that's fine, right? Like I'd rather be somebody that's working on it than pretending it's not happening and then hurting other people as a result of it.
That was author Tracy McMillan speaking about her book, The White Bonus, with Stephen Henderson on Created Equal. You can find Created Equal on WDET.org at the website or wherever you find your podcasts. It is the Metro on 1019 WDET, where I am Nick Austin. And not only do we have Stephen Henderson here at WDET, we also have intrepid reporters like Nargis Rahman, who joins me right now. And one of the reasons why is our next discussion, which dives into family history. In fact, how often do people know their family history? And what does that not knowing do for them? For some Bengali Americans, their family stories are more complicated than they realize. That's part of the story of the new documentary In Search of Bengali Harlem. The film, which premieres today at 8 p.m. on PBS, tells the untold story of Muslim Bengali men who worked for British steamships in the early 1900s. The documentary is brought together in part by co-director Aladdin Eulah's journey to learn about his father. Co-director Vivek Bald says these Bengali men jumped off the British ships at ports like New York and Baltimore and began a new life among Puerto Rican and African American communities. Some of them later found themselves working in Detroit. To discuss this film and history, we have WDET's Nargis Rahman with us. She recently spoke with the co-director of the film. Nargis, welcome back to the Metro.
Thank you.
So, Nargis, this is a really interesting story, especially this idea of a number of Muslim Bengali men working on these British ships in the early 1900s and jumping off around New York and other city ports and then just blending themselves into these different communities. Can you tell us first, before we get into the story, how'd you even find out about it?
Well, a couple of years ago, I heard that there was this book called Bengali Harlem, made by one of the co-directors of this film, that explored the oral histories of Bengali men who lived in some of these black and brown communities. And then last year at the Free Film Festival, they were in town to show this documentary to the local community here. So I got a chance to talk to both of the directors then and really catch up on what that means. I think the first thing that jumped out was that I didn't even know this happened, right? And this was in part because in the early 1900s, Bangladeshi men, Bengali men, were not allowed to even come to the U.S. and be here because there were immigration laws that prevented that from happening.
Yeah, I want to play a clip from the trailer so we get an idea of this. This is the trailer from In Search of Bengali Harlem.
I would get these parts. The money was really good, but after a while, I was getting so angry. And I remember one director says, "Who was your father?" Well, I don't really know. There's a void in my life. Like, I really have to know who my father is.
That was co-director of the film, Aladdin Eula, who is an actor and comedian. He goes on in search of his father, and that seems to be kicking off the film. But I'm wondering why both he and Vivek decided to make this documentary.
So Vivek Bald was already known for making documentaries in the South Asian community. And then when Aladdin wanted to play parts in Hollywood, he realized that he was getting stereotypical roles of like the angry Muslim man or the, accent South Asian man. And he realized that that's not really who South Asians are, and that there's this rich history of them being here for a long time and integrating into these communities. And when he noticed that people didn't know about that and he couldn't prove that in Hollywood, he went to Vivek and said, we have to do something about that. So let's make a documentary film to show this rich history. And so that took him on a journey to learn more about his own dad, who had passed away at this point. That took him to a trip to Bangladesh, where he also learned more about his mom. And then he was able to kind of put all these different puzzles together later in life.
So what happened to a lot of these men, like Aladdin's father? What are the ways that they tried to integrate into American life and culture?
Well, when they came here, they weren't exactly welcomed into white neighborhoods. So the black and brown communities welcomed them. And a lot of times they married Puerto Rican or African-American women and had whole families with them. And people like Aladdin's father, his wife passed away. So then he went back to Bangladesh and remarried to a Bangladeshi woman and brought her here. And so by that time, it was a lot more acceptable to have Bangladeshi communities here. It wasn't until 1965 that you could even apply to be for a visa to come here, or a lot of times gain citizenship as somebody from the South Asian subcontinent. So people, also came from New York and other cities and other ports, came to Detroit to work for the automobile industry, which I think is interesting because people are still coming to Detroit for the same reason.
So Detroit also plays a role here, and let's play a clip from the interview you did with Vivek Bald.
So from this wave of ship workers who found work in the auto industry, Detroit, gained a number of interracial families where the father was Bengali Muslim and the mother was African American. There are some prominent people prominent Detroiters who have that background, including former Congressman Henson Clark, a member of the Four Tops, the Duke Fakir.
The Four Tops, we're talking about high-level politicians. Interesting point that there were so much of this integration, even in places we might not know about. How did these Muslim Bengali men end up in Detroit, and what were their lives like when they were here?
So a lot of them, became part of the auto industry, as we talked about, but also they began opening businesses and rebuilding neighborhoods that might have been torn down or run down. And a lot of these communities are still building out of places like Hamtramck in Detroit, where you can see that immigrant and older Bangladeshi families have been establishing and building back these neighborhoods. And now you can see a reminiscent of that build up throughout Metro Detroit, not only in Hamtramck and Detroit, but there's lots of communities in Troy, Sterling Heights, Warren, out in Bloomfield Hills. And so there's this rich history that's preserved through these stories.
Well, Nargis, you're Bangladeshi. I'm wondering if this made you reanalyze your own history or family lineage at all.
Absolutely. One of the things in Bangladeshi culture is that you don't always get a chance to sit down with your elders and really find out how they came to the U.S., what led them up to that point. You do know that they came here for better socioeconomic opportunities. But when I heard about this story, Bengali Harlem, it really invited me to call one of my uncles up in New York and ask him, when did my maternal grandfather come to the U.S.? I had a rough idea, but I didn't know the context behind that. And I found out that he came in 1973, which was 2 years after Bangladesh became a country. So if you look at the story about Bengali Harlem, these men were still a part of India because it was under British rule. And so by ethnicity, they were Bengali. But then in 1971, they were nationally Bangladeshi because they were from some of the cities in Bangladesh. And so I realized that my grandfather came at a time when there was a lot of turmoil in South Asia, in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, but he became a part of this rich history of generations of Bangladeshis that came way before us. And one of the points the co-directors of this film make is that the working class stories of Bangladeshi men have been erased, because a lot of times when you think about South Asians in America, you think about middle class and upper class Indians who were able to come through immigration laws and some of the rules that were in place in the 1960s that allowed them to come, but you don't think about the working class families who have been here.
Real quick, if people want to find out more about the film, what should they do? Where can they go?
They can go to BengaliHarlem.com/watch and also watch it on PBS tonight at 8 p.m.
All right, Nargis Rahman, reporter at WDET. Thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you as always.
It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET, and coming up, we'll talk about the upcoming reopening of Dutch Girl Donuts. It's the Metro on 101.9 WDET. I'm Nick Austin, and I hope you're not hungry right now, because this next story might not help you out there much. Back in 1947, Dutch Girl Donuts first opened its doors on Woodward Avenue, and at the time, it was renowned for so many things, including not only the sweets, but also that iconic blue awning. But now, after a brief closure, it's set to return this summer, and to find out more about the reopening, we're joined by the new owner making it happen, Paddy Lynch. Paddy, welcome to the Metro.
Thank for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm happy to have you here also, because before we get into the reopening, because again, I'm seeing this everywhere, I wanted you have a background in doing other things, including running a funeral home in a schwitz. I don't really think of sweets when it comes to this. So let's just start with your earliest memories of Dutch Girl Donuts. What does this shop mean to you personally?
Yeah, I started going there when I was a little boy, because when my parents were dating in the early 70s, my mom went to Marygrove and lived down by Dutch Girl. And so when my dad was, courting her, he said that he'd stop into Dutch Girl more than he likes to admit. And it became a part of his life well before I was born. So growing up, my dad was always taking my sister and me into Dutch Girl if we were up and down Woodward, and became a very special highlight for me. And then when I moved to Detroit, 13, 14 years ago, I live right off Woodward Avenue. It became part of my daily commute to the funeral home. So I used to pick them up in the morning for the staff, and was as devastated as many Detroiters when it closed a few years ago.
Yeah, well, I tell you, first of all, a bunch of Dutch Girl Donuts hitting your midriff might not help so much with the courting, but I'm glad it worked out for your dad.
Yeah.
And this opportunity to buy Dutch Girl Donuts, what led you to decide, you know what, I'm going to pick up the baton and run with it?
Yeah, it really wasn't on my radar too much. I'm busy with a lot of other things. I got married a few years ago. We've got 2 little girls, so I'm pretty busy. And but the interesting connection to the Timmer family, who's owned it since 1947, is my cousin Tim Lynch Jr., also a funeral director. He grew up with the Timmers, and he ended up handling funeral services for Cecilia, Dutch girl herself, her son and daughter-in-law a few years ago. So he had this special, intimate relationship with the family, and I didn't even know that. And after the parents died a few years ago and the shop closed, my cousin sort of mentioned to me in passing, "Hey, would you be interested?" And I didn't really think much about it. And then when I found out, that publicly it may never reopen again, that's when I spoke with my wife, and she said, "Oh, you can pursue this." Usually she tells me when I have a bad idea, but she let me pursue it. I wrote the family a letter and told them that I'd like to keep it going and to keep John, the grandson who's been making donuts in there for years, keep him around and some of the former employees. And so it just worked out, but it was serendipitous, I guess.
Yeah, well, I think that's a lot of the question that we have also. How much of the old tradition's going to stay? Did you get all of the recipes? What's going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, what's amazing about it is John Timmer, Joe, and Letitia, who are like the three main donut makers and were for years, they're back, as are many of the former employees. And so my goal was to not have much change at all. We did take the opportunity to really freshen the place up, paint it, all new lighting, new equipment, polish the terrazzo floors. So the building's really in great shape right now and ready for its return. And so I'm really happy about that. But as far as like the recipes and everything that people loved about it, nothing much has changed.
Are you going to add anything? A little bit of that Lynch flair there?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that we're doing that I think are cool. The Bacheris brothers are longtime coffee roasters based in Highland Park. They've been there for over 100 years, and they're good friends of mine. And so they've created a Dutch Girl coffee blend specifically for the shop. So we'll have really good coffee, and people can buy bags of coffee to go. And then we're in conversations with Ray's Ice Cream about doing a Dutch Girl line of ice cream this summer. So I think adding really good coffee and ice cream to the shop will be a nice touch.
Those things seem to go together. One of the things, we already know that you've had the soft launch. People saw that you were giving out some donuts. Do we have a specific date? Do we know when we're going to open up and people can come in?
Yeah. We actually announced that yesterday. So Saturday at 8 a.m. we will open the doors, and we'll be open. Historically, they weren't open on Sundays, but we are going to be open on Sundays. So it'll be Saturday and Sunday, 8 to 4, and then Tuesday through Friday, 6 to 6. We're not going to be open on Mondays. We're going to do Sundays open and close on Mondays. And, for years, they were 24 hours a day. We hope that the production level is high enough maybe come fall that we can get to 24 hours, but to start, we'll be 6 to 6 during the week.
That's still a pretty good amount of time to get your sweets going. I mean, like when it comes to finding out more information about it, what's the best way for people to do that?
We've got a website up, DutchGirlDetroit.com, which will have hours, and then we're pretty active on social media. So, best thing to do is just drive by and help yourself. It's a beautiful place, and it's it's a great tradition for Detroiters.
Yeah, another thing I was thinking about, we got about a minute left, but we did bring up the fact that Lynch & Sons funeral directors, right? Third generation, you've been doing that. We did discuss the Schwitz.
Yeah.
Is there anything about running these businesses that are in completely different worlds? Now you're doing this one. Anything that just kind of struck you or that you're bringing to the table from it? How does that inform what you're doing now with Dutch Girl?
I mean, I'm a sentimental guy, and I've got a lot of, my own nostalgia about Dutch Girl in Detroit, and I think funeral service has led me in that way. I care about history, and I care about family history, and in some ways I feel like I'm honoring my own family history and my parents' romance by keeping the shop going, and honoring the Timmer family who devoted 3 generations there. So.
Paddy Lynch, owner of Dutch Girl Donuts, opening up this Saturday. Thank you for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
That's going to do it for this edition of the Metro, Thursday, May 9th. You can listen to recent episodes online at WDET.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. The show is produced by Sam Corey, David Lyons, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender. The Metro is a production of WDET, a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. If you like what you hear and want to support the Metro, consider becoming a member at WDET.org/donate. This is 1019 WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
WDET is supported by the College of Business Administration at University of Detroit Mercy. UDM is offering a new master's degree in ethical leadership focused on sustainable, ethical, and inclusive problem solving. More information at business.udmercy.edu.